Okay, thank you to everyone joining us here today in person and online. I'm Lizzie Shackelford. I am the Senior Policy Director here at the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding. One of our goals at the Dickey Center is to uphold our namesake's vision. Dartmouth President John Sloan Dickey, who urged all of us to see the world's problems as our problems, and to see what those of us here at Dartmouth and beyond can do to help take on these challenges. This event is made possible by the Middle East Initiative, which is a collaborative effort of the Dickey Center and the Middle East Studies and Jewish Studies programs here at Dartmouth. And it's also part of the Dartmouth Dialogues. The Middle East Initiative grew out of the Middle East Dialogues effort, which was launched last year after the October 7th attacks and the outbreak of war, in an effort to foster meaningful conversations on difficult and contentious issues. The purpose of these events is to present different perspectives on these challenges in order to prepare our students to thoughtfully and constructively engage with different viewpoints in the future. I know from my own experience as a U.S. diplomat that understanding the drivers, sources of support, and influence on all sides of any conflict or confrontation is an essential part to building durable solutions. Analyzing Hamas and its support base, therefore, is an essential part to understanding how a future peace might be built in the Middle East. And that's what we're here to learn about today. Tonight's discussion will explore who supports Hamas, why, and what impact that has. To help us answer these questions, we have Dr. Khalil Shikaki, who is a professor of political science and director of the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research in Ramallah. He's also a senior fellow at the Crown Center for Middle East Studies at Brandeis University, co-founder of the Arab Barometer and the Arab Reform Initiative, and co-author of the annual report on the Arab Democracy Index. Dr. Shikaki has conducted hundreds of polls among Palestinians and dozens among Israelis. His research focuses on Palestinian state building, on public opinion, security sector reform, and the impact of domestic Palestinian politics on the peace process. He'll be in conversation today with Professor Ben Valentino, Associate Dean for Social Sciences and a professor in the Government Department here at Dartmouth. Professor Valentino's research focuses on the causes, consequences, and prevention of violent conflict, and he is the co-creator of the Early Warning Project, which assesses the risk of mass atrocities in countries around the world. Professor Valentino will moderate the discussion for around a half hour before turning to questions from the audience. At that stage, when we shift to the audience, please note we're going to ask people with questions to line up at the microphone on this side of the room. We will be prioritizing questions from students during that time as well, but we'll take questions from anyone to the extent that we have time. Thank you again for joining us for this timely and essential conversation. And now to you.
Thank you. Thanks. I want to extend my thanks to everyone for coming, especially all the students here. It's really great to see a full house of young faces. There's a little feedback. We'll see if... Is that helping at all? A little bit. So I'm really glad that you are all here, and I'm really especially glad that Professor Shikaki is here with us also. I've been following his work for decades. I was saying earlier, to the extent we really understand in some kind of scientific way where the Palestinian people are on a whole range of issues, most of that understanding comes from the work that this man has been doing for 30 years to try to help us understand Palestinian ideas, beliefs, attitudes. And I think it should just be obvious to anyone, no matter what side of the issues that come out of what happened on October 7th or even long before that, whatever side you're on, that understanding where the Palestinian people are, what they believe, and why is critical to get us to any stable solution to the conflict, whatever you think about it. And so we need people like Professor Shikaki to continue to do his work. So I think we're really fortunate to have him here with us, and I want to thank you for coming up to Dartmouth tonight. I have lots and lots of questions. I'm sure I will not get through all the questions I have written down, you guys should start thinking of some good ones. This is really a special opportunity, and so I encourage you to take advantage of it. But I want to start with a question that I know you get all the time, and you probably get it even more often now. I do some public opinion polling in my own work. Much of it's in the United States, but some of it's in other countries. Anyone who's been following the efforts of pollsters to gauge the opinion of the American people recently knows just how difficult a task that has become. No one answers their phone anymore, and pollsters tie themselves in knots trying to figure out whether they've got a representative sample or not. The problem that you are facing in trying to poll the Palestinian people is, that times a million. And that was true even before the conflict broke out on October 7th. Now, not only do you face the problems you had before of reaching Palestinians in a place with relatively little infrastructure, poor records on where everybody is, but of course the fact that a majority of the population is dislocated, and of course there are political fears about expressing opinions to a pollster. So just because every other question I'm going to ask you is about what your polls tell us, I want to find out at the beginning, how are you confident that your polls have surmounted all of these challenges and that we can trust the results that your polls tell us?
It's a very good question and a very legitimate question, of course. When we started conducting surveys among Palestinians for the first time ever, this was 1993. It's not because we didn't try before. As political scientists, the first class I went to was in 1986. And I discovered from my students that they have little idea what is going on with their neighbors. Their own neighbors, not the Israelis, but their own Palestinian neighbors. When I divided my class into two groups, and I asked them what they think, how is society, how do they see society? Each group said, we represent the overwhelming majority of our society. And I said, what is the evidence? And there was none. So I was hoping that I would then, in '86, do my first survey. A few days later, the Israeli military governor of Nablus, this is where I was teaching at Al-Najah University, called me to his office and said, I hear you want to do a survey. I said, yes. And he said, we're not allowing you to do a survey. I said, why? He said, because you're going to show that the Palestinians support the PLO. Our government does not think that this is the right message we want to send to anybody. So we're not allowing you to do it. If you do it, we will expel you from the country. I decided not to do it. So '86, then a year later, we had the first intifada. And we, of course, have absolutely no idea what dynamics have led to it, what were the dynamics that were making it sustainable, and until 1993, when earlier, in '92, in fact, it was very clear that things are changing after Madrid and so on. And when we started to do the surveys, I had a similar call from a different military governor in Nablus also. That first center we established to do surveys was in Nablus. And he told me, I know we told you in the past that you can't do surveys, but now I'm happy to tell you that you can do surveys. So the Israelis have learned something. The first intifada and the fact that all of their information was incorrect, that they did not understand the social change in Palestinian society, which led to the first intifada, finally woke up and decided that this is something perhaps that's also good for them, not just for us. So 3 problems confronted us back then, and they still confront us today. One is sampling. And although in 1997 we had the first census among Palestinians basically gave us all the data we need to create a sampling frame. Not only did we have the data, but we also had maps, and we continue to have maps for every single home. I can find my own home in these maps, and I can't find the home of every single Palestinian. So doing a sample today is a lot easier than when we first started in 93. We had to wait until 97 to have reliable data on the distribution of the population. The second problem is we do not have a democratic political system. We do not have a democratic society either. And so in a society that is non-democratic, in a political system that is non-democratic, this hasn't changed. We remain a non-democratic society and a non-democratic political system until today. So the difficulty here is how do you convince people to talk to you when they might worry that you are a spy for somebody? It's not a democracy. And so that was the second challenge. This we think we have overcome because we realized from the beginning that this is going to be a real challenge. The only way we could overcome this is to convince our data collectors that the data they collect is useless unless they are convinced that the person they're talking to is whispering in their ear. If that person comes to that conclusion, he can or she can whisper, then the data collection process becomes reliable at that point. We think we have done that. We think we have successfully managed to train our data collectors so that they can do that and that people do want to talk to them. And so even in a non-democratic political system, you can still find ways in which you can convince people to talk to you, even when you start. This is why it is absolutely critical that we do not do interviews over the phone. If I pick up the phone and somebody tells me I'm this or that person, how on earth am I going to know that he's telling me the truth? Why wouldn't that person be an Israeli intelligence officer or a Palestinian intelligence officer? So it has to be my ability as a data collector to convince you that you can trust me is absolutely critical. And the third issue, of course, is that, well, we're asking very sensitive questions, and this is a conflict area. You are living in a conflict area where violence is used occasionally, sometimes quite often. During the Second Intifada, violence was a daily occurrence. And since October the 7th, it is. And so how do you convince people to answer sensitive questions? We ask questions like, do you support suicide attacks? We don't ask people, would you participate in that? That is one of the things that we prevent ourselves from asking. We will not ask our respondents any questions that might put them at risk. But we do ask them a lot of other sensitive issues. Is the Palestinian Authority corrupt? Well, some people might be reluctant to answer that question. It's not because of the issue of democracy, but because there's conflict and people die for saying things like that.
But your polls show they're willing to,
they are willing
to express their discontent.
And that is a testimony to the professionalism of our data collectors. The problem, however, that we confront today in Gaza is the same problem we confronted in 93 throughout the Palestinian territories, in part, not in every respect. We have only 1/3 of Gazans who still live in their homes. 1/3. 2/3 of Gazans today do not live in their homes. They live in shelters, two types of shelters. Built-up shelters, where it is easier to identify the population in the shelters, in all of the shelters, and know where they come from, because each shelter has a manager and an organization that provides assistance and knows everyone and where they are located in the shelter. And we take that data from them. We cooperate with all those managers who are in charge of these shelters. And the second type of shelters, which is now the one that is the most populated shelter, is the tent shelters. These are much less organized. We have to send our data collectors on daily basis to these locations so that they can keep updating our database on where people are. And in some cases, you have people who have, we asked this question in our survey, so that this could help us determine where people are and from where they have come. We asked them, how many times have you been relocated from one place to the other? In some cases, you have families who have relocated 7 or 8 times. So that is the challenge that we confront today. It forces us, instead of having a regular area probability sampling, for those of you who are familiar with sampling, sorry that I'm using now this term, jargon, but area probability sampling means I know where I'm heading, I know where I will be, I know the apartment that I will be reaching, to quota. Quota sampling means there are people from Jabalia who are no longer living in Jabalia, and I will be meeting them in shelters in Rafah or Khan Yunis. So I have to know how many of those people I need to meet in order for my sample to be representative of the people of Jabalia. So it is a quota sample.
So I hope that at least gives you a sense of just how difficult this task is. And it's really amazing that you've continued to conduct polls since October 7th. I'm going to ask you a ton about the attitudes of the people in Gaza and the West Bank regarding Hamas and the conflict. But I don't want to continue without asking you another important question, because I know you don't just poll on their political attitudes, but you're asking them about what their experiences have been over the last year. And I think we know better because of the polls that you've done what exactly people in Gaza especially, but also the West Bank, have been going through over the last year. And so I wonder if you'll tell us a little bit about what the polls say about what's happened in the lives of ordinary people in Gaza and the West Bank.
Well, and we do, of course, when we ask people to tell us what is the threat they're facing today, there is one word that they use, and it's one word that everybody knows. It's called genocide. So that's their response. By the way, this is also the same word we hear from Israeli Jews. This is not just the Palestinians. For Israeli Jews, what happened on October the 7th was also Palestinians attempting genocide against Israeli Jews. For Palestinians who live in Gaza and the West Bank, what Israel is currently doing is nothing but genocide. That Israel either wants to kill everyone in Gaza or force them out of Gaza. That is their perception. And of course, they feel essentially helpless in meeting the challenge. The difficulty is, based on our surveys, about 80% of Gazans, slightly less than that, have lost someone, either killed or injured. 60% of all Gazans say they have someone killed. In the early surveys, the majority, 2/3 of Gazans, when asked, do you have water and food for the next 2 days, said no, they don't have food and water for 2 days. Today, it is actually much better, by the way. But we do not, I should have mentioned this when you asked me earlier, because of the conditions in Gaza, we prevent our data collectors from working in areas that we determine to be unsafe. So where the Israeli army says you're not allowed to be, where the army asks people to relocate, we prevent our data collectors from accessing those areas. That means the entire northern part of the Gaza Strip is forbidden for our data collectors to go to. And so it is these people who, however, have no access to food or water, so we don't know the situation there. I wish we were waiting for a ceasefire agreement so that we can go to the north and ask those people. Actually, we don't know how many people are still in the north. It ranges between 200 to 400,000. But we have little information about their access to food and shelter and so on. So the difficulties that they face are extreme, but it is the fear of death that seems to be the most important issue that we confront as we try to assess the threat perception of the Palestinians in Gaza.
All right, let's turn now to the events of the last year and how Palestinians are viewing them. And I'm interested both what you know about their reaction in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, and then how those views have changed, if they have, over the course of the conflict. And so the first question is just the obvious one. How do Palestinians view those attacks? What did they see as their purpose? How do they think about them? As you said, Israelis perceive them as a genocidal attack, just as Palestinians perceive the response as genocidal. But what do Palestinians think about the attacks of October 7th and responsibility for the deaths that occurred? How are they incorporating that into their worldview?
Let me say two things before I tell you that. One is there are significant differences that we find between Gazans and West Bankers. Gazans, from day one, have been the most critical of Hamas and what Hamas did, continue to be most critical. The critical views of Gazans have over time increased rather than decreased. West Bankers are much less critical of Hamas, and although there has also been some change, particularly in the last 3 to 6 months, this change has not been as pronounced, as important as the change that we see among Gazans. The second thing is Gazans lived under extreme conditions of siege and blockade before October the 7th, and they witnessed 4 previous wars that were similar to this war in almost everything, with the exception of the duration of the war. And so there is, of course, a lot of pain, and the threat perception was extremely high even before. So what do we find? Well, we find that there is a tremendous support for what Hamas did on October the 7th. But it's not tremendous support for atrocities. Hamas committed atrocities on October the 7th, but most Palestinians are either in denial or actually don't know that Hamas committed atrocities. Those who believe Hamas committed atrocities do not support what happened on October the 7th and do not support Hamas. But the overwhelming majority of the Palestinians, as I said, are either in denial or do not, or have not seen videos or evidence. And when we ask them, did Hamas commit atrocities on October the 7th? Their answer is no, Hamas did not, by 90%. So only 10% of Palestinians. Now, if you go to Gaza, that 10% actually becomes almost 1/3 of Gaza. So, and 2-3% of West Bankers say yes, Hamas committed atrocities, compared to 25 to 30%, and that has increased over time. Why? West Bankers say, we've not seen evidence. We've not seen. We asked them, haven't you seen the videos that are out there? They show Hamas committing atrocities, some of which were filmed by Hamas fighters. Their answer is no, we have not. The media that we watch the most has not shown such videos. When we ask them, what media have you been watching? It is Al Jazeera. So Al Jazeera in Arabic has not shown, and it is, I can confirm that Al Jazeera has not shown such videos. Al Jazeera in English did, by the way, but not in Arabic. And so West Bankers watch Al Jazeera by 80 to 85%. That's their main source of information. By the way, when we asked the Israeli Jews the same question about atrocities, no, Israeli army does not commit atrocities. Absolutely not. What is the source of information? Only Israeli media. So they don't watch CNN, they don't watch BBC, they certainly don't watch Al Jazeera. So they watch Israeli TV. 12, 13, some 14, of course, as well. I know you don't know what these challenges are about. I'm sure Bernie can explain that. So the support for October the 7th was pronounced in a lot more in the West Bank than in Gaza. Today, by the way, a majority of Gazans no longer believes that what Hamas did on October the 7th was correct. So the majority of Gazans have moved. It was not a big majority to begin with, but now it is the minority of Gazans who believe that what Hamas did on October the 7th was the right thing. The question is about, however, justification. Is it justified for Hamas to do what it did on October the 7th? We find a large majority of Palestinians, 70% or more, who says yes. The siege and blockade that Israel imposed on Gaza on all these years before October the 7th justifies what Hamas did on October the 7th. Once again, keep in mind that your perception of what happens on October the 7th is different than their perception of what happens on October the 7th. For many Palestinians, Hamas was mainly attacking Israeli military bases around the periphery in Gaza, and not the towns. Yes, there might have been attacks on towns, and yes, Hamas did take hostages. By the way, a majority of Palestinians believe Hamas should not have taken civilians hostages. A majority of Palestinians believe Hamas taking civilians hostages is a war crime, and it is against international law. So there is a recognition of that in the answers from day one, by the way. We found a majority of Palestinians that said, this is against international law, this is a war crime, Hamas should not have done it. We had a majority in both the West Bank and Gaza regarding that. Today, as I said, things are cooling down. Gazans have moved significantly from the positions they have taken. In the last survey we did, which was in September last month, we have found that most Gazans, anywhere between 50 to 70%, are very, very critical of Hamas, do not want Hamas to come back to control Gaza, believe when the last leader of Hamas was Yahya Sinwar. Sinwar is loved by West Bankers, but hated by Gazans. So our last survey shows Sinwar is very, very popular in the West Bank, competing with the most popular leader in the West Bank, Marwan Barghouthi, effectively. In Gaza, only a minority of Gazans. That minority, by the way, in Gaza that still admires, again, he was alive when we did that survey, that admired Sinwar was less than the core supporters of Hamas. So the core supporters are those who share Hamas's values. On Sinwar, those who admired Sinwar were less than that percentage.
Can you say, and I think this applies especially then to those in the West Bank who still don't see October 7th as a mistake, but obviously some in Gaza as well. What's your understanding of the mindset of these people in the sense of how do they see what happened, the actions on October 7th, as leading to something better for the Palestinian people? How does it advance their interest? Do they, even after a year of punishing war, see this as ultimately producing some kind of better life for them?
People in both West Bank and Gaza are conflicted on this issue. On the one hand, if we ask them, has October the 7th changed the environment regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Is the Palestinian-Israeli conflict today more or less central to the thinking of everyone about the need to resolve the conflict? 70% will say yes. October the 7th forced the international community and Palestinians and Israelis to finally understand that there isn't going to be any peace or stability in this part of the world without resolving the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. That the Arab normalization attempts to make Arab-Israeli peace and to put the Palestinian-Israeli issue on the side burner, that this was never going to work, and here's the evidence that it does not work. So you need to resolve this conflict once and for all. On the other hand, if you ask, well, what about all the destruction? All of this, is this good for the Palestinians? Has this advanced the interest of the Palestinian people? This is a different question. But here's where we see how conflicted people are. The answer by 70% also is no, it has not. It has been bad for the Palestinian people. So the issue of why are people thinking that this is forcing the issue? Because Palestinians have, in recent years, particularly during the last decade, have come to the conclusion that Israel is comfortable with the status quo, that Israel does not want to end its occupation, that as long as there is no pain and suffering on the Israeli side, like the pain and suffering on the Palestinian side, Israelis are not going to be willing to make any concessions to the Palestinians. Why end the occupation if the occupation is not costing you much? So the Palestinians have come to the conclusion that therefore the only way we can end the Israeli occupation is by inflicting pain and suffering on the Israelis so that they can wake up one day and decide that, well, in terms of cost and benefit, this is not working for us and we need to put an end to it. So this is where Palestinians were on October the 7th. This is where things have actually continued to go, I would say, all the way up to 3-4 months ago, when we begin to see in Gaza in particular, people who are saying, this too is not working. Diplomacy is dead, yes, we recognize that before October the 7th. We hope that this is going to change things, but it is not changing things. Israelis want to destroy us even more rather than less. They're not trying to reach out to make peace with us. So violence does not work, just like diplomacy is not working. Not in the West Bank, by the way. West Bankers continue to believe that violence pays, the majority of West Bankers. So in Gaza, we continue to have a large majority in favor of violence, by the way, after the Israelis unilaterally pulled out from Gaza in 2005. Gazans came to the conclusion, this is the language the Israelis understand. We forced them out of Gaza by violence, by using violence, and West Bankers should do the same. West Bankers, whose conclusion from the Second Intifada was the exact opposite, that the Second Intifada was failed. Israel was able to come out victorious from the Second Intifada. That's a very different perception than that of Gazans. Came out to the conclusion that, okay, so let's put an end to the violence, and the majority of Palestinians by 2005 have come in the West Bank. Came to the conclusion by 80% that violence does not pay. And therefore we should stop violence. This is why Abbas won the elections in 2005, because that is the perception at that point in the West Bank. But
this has changed now.
Until 10 years ago. 2015 is the year, almost 10 years ago, is the year when by the end of 2015, by around this time, our September survey showed, and we didn't notice it, by the way, until December. I tell you why. But September, our survey showed that among the youth and in certain parts of the West Bank, a majority was now in favor of violence. We paid attention to our findings in November, because in November, the violence escalates significantly in 2015 in certain parts of the West Bank. And when we looked at the data was telling us that back in September. The West Bank faces a lot of challenges that are different than those in Gaza. In Gaza, it's the siege and blockade. In the West Bank, settlers are there. There's settler violence every single day. There is an Israeli government that is determines to build more and more settlements, take away more and more land from the Palestinians, demolish their homes. So every day there's a story for West Bankers. And at the same time, they see their own Palestinian Authority failing to defend them against settler violence, failing to help them in any way move things forward, stop what the Israelis are doing against them, but failing. So there is a gradual collapse of the credibility of the Palestinian Authority. There is significant rise in threat perception regarding settlers and the Israeli army. And Hamas is building up in Gaza. And so when October the 7th comes, for West Bankers, well, this is our time. This is the opportunity.
You've been talking a lot about I think what most people see as the main division in Palestinian public opinion between Gaza and West Bank. I'm curious, though, apart from that key schism, what do you see as the other main drivers? Do we see big differences on some of the issues we've been talking about between women and men, between the highly religious and the more secular folks, or along any of the other divisions that you collect data on?
Yes, there are significant differences based on values. We also see significant differences between age groups, but it also has to do with values more than anything else. Take 18 to 29, what we call youth. This age group is the most liberal in our society, is the least religious in our society. So religiosity among this age group is about 18%. 18% when asked to self-identify, are they religious, not religious? Only 18% say they're religious. When we talk to their parents and grandparents, 45 to 60% say they're religious. So there is, and because of that, it's not the only reason, but this is one of the reasons, liberalism comes out of that. So liberalism, both socially, in terms of women's rights, for example, as well as in terms of politics. The insistence of the 18 to 29 on democracy as a fundamental attribute of governance leads them, for example, to oppose the two-state solution. Why? Because they think in a two-state solution, the future Palestinian state will be corrupt and authoritarian, not democratic. And that leaves them to come to the conclusion that they should not support that kind of outcome. They should support an outcome that can produce a democratic system. And they think that could happen only if there is one single state where Jews and Palestinians have equal rights. That also means support for Hamas among the 18 to 29 is the least level of support. That the older you are, the more likely that you will support Hamas. Income is also important, but it also has to do with values, indirectly. If you are poor, I don't know, I haven't looked at recent American data, whether this is true in this country as well. But in Palestine, the poorer you are, the more religious you are. If you are middle class, you're somewhat religious. If you are the upper class, if your income is high, you're least likely to be religious. Well, that means that Hamas has much greater support in places that are religious, because they are places where poverty is widespread. And that means Gaza. So Gaza is more likely to have that kind of socioeconomic condition that leads to religiosity, that leads to greater support for Hamas. But it also means there is one additional aspect about Palestinian society that leaves its impact on gender issues. And that is, despite the fact that the majority of Palestinians are not religious, the split is about 35 to 65. So slightly more than a third are religious. The rest, I'm talking about the total society. In the West Bank is different. Religiosity is less than that in Gaza. But Palestinian society is not very liberal. With the exception of the youth, Palestinian society is conservative. Even those who are not religious, they are conservative. Why are they conservative? Because they want to remain in control of their women. And that means women are forced to become religious from childhood. Well, that means women will vote for Hamas. more than they would vote for Fatah or some other secular nationalists. So here are some of the socioeconomic and how they impact gender issues and age groups.
That's very interesting. I have a question I think is appropriate for this group, and I don't know whether you've done any polling on this, but obviously there have been across many American campuses and in universities around the world protests on both sides of the issue, but many in favor of Palestinian rights, protecting Palestinian people. And I'm curious about how Palestinians are viewing those protests. And I'll just say, I've seen even among our own students, some of whom took part in the protests, some concern, are these protests actually about us and the rights of us privileged people here? And are we detracting from the situation that's actually going on the ground in Gaza? I haven't done a poll of our students. I don't know how common those views are, but I've had more than one student express that concern to me. I wonder how these protests are viewed by Palestinians, if you know yet.
Yes, we asked about this. For Palestinians, this is one of the benefits of October the 7th, that there is much greater solidarity with Palestinians throughout the world, that Israel is becoming under greater criticism than any time before. The reason that the Palestinians consider this to be good is because they hope that this can be translated into governments putting pressure on the state of Israel. Does that mean that when the protesters in campuses here say, Palestine, free Palestine, or from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, is that what we find among Palestinians today? The answer is no, that is not what we find. If anything, October the 7th and the war has led to much greater Palestinian advocacy for the two-state solution. In the last 6 months in particular, we have seen significant rise in support. It's not a majority yet, but we're getting very close to a majority. And in fact, when we begin to clarify what a two-state solution means, when, for example, if the traditional question we ask about the two-state solution is, there's talk about having two states, the state of Palestine next to the state of Israel, what's known as the two-state solution, do you support or oppose? This is very conceptual. It doesn't really define where and under what attributes and so on. But if I said a two-state solution whereby the Palestinian state is created within the boundaries of 1967, I cross the margin of 50% immediately. If I add few additional things, I can get even more support for the two-state solution. So what was the situation before October the 7th? Only 1/3 supported. Now we are getting, in September we had 40%, and if I added the 6 or 7 borders, I get 55%, and I can get even more when I give people additional attributes of that state, particularly if I give them incentives to support a two-state solution. I can get a 2/3 majority in favor of that.
I'm going to ask one last question, turn it over to the audience. You spent a lot of time studying public opinion in Palestine. As you said, it's not a democracy. If it ever briefly was, it's certainly not now. What is the role of Palestinian public opinion in the West Bank and Gaza? How much do these opinions, beliefs, attitudes that you've talked about influence the decision of Palestinian leaders, either in Hamas or Fatah? How important is it to them that they respond to what their people want?
Yes, we're not a democracy, but we are still able to do surveys. You know who is the first to come to knock at our door for access to our data? Immediately, even before it is released, because they have already heard that we have conducted a survey. It is our intelligence officers. And do you know why they come? What is the question that they have in mind? How is the health of the president? Health of the president, what they mean is, Are people ready to come to the president's office and crash it? Are they ready to rise violently against Abbas? And so far, every time they came, my answer was no. He's safe. He's fine.
Not this time.
That's it. And that's a certain group. But I can tell you that over time, there has been a great deal of importance. We get Hamas leaders wanting all the information about their own status, their own popularity, and not just their popularity, but their policies as well. When Arafat was alive, Arafat asked me, and I delivered, to give him a one-page summary of every single poll so that he can read it. And he used it highly effectively. I had one call one day from the head of the Rabin's office in '95, in which he said, you know, this piece of paper that you sent to President Arafat, could you please send it to our office? Why, I said? He said, because your president keeps bringing it up every time he meets with Rabin. So we want to be prepared. Before he surprises us, we want to know what you have sent him. So Arafat was interested, and Rabin was interested. Hamas people were interested. Our intelligence people are interested. Yes, of course, on certain things that they have in mind. When the findings, I used to have a very, very close relationship to Abbas. I've never worked for him, but I had a very good relationship with him. I used to visit him at home and sit with him and show him the results, and he was very, very much interested until things started to go sour for him. Then he lost interest. However, people in his office continued to force him to pay attention until recently. But they did force him. And I would ask them, so when you give him bad news, what is his reaction? Does he say, this is nonsense, this is not true? He said, no, actually, he has a lot of respect for the data. But he basically says, I don't care what the public thinks about things. So he has changed over time. He basically no longer, I no longer actually send him our findings because of that.
Okay, I have asked enough questions. I'd really like to hear from the audience. If you have a question, please head over here to that microphone and fire away. We would really like to hear from you guys. I know I asked a lot, but I didn't ask them all. I'm sure there are still some questions to ask. Go ahead.
Thank you.
Is the microphone working over here?
Yeah.
It is, okay, good.
Thank you, Professor Khalil Shikaki, for coming here. I got on like 3 little questions. I will start with the first. You've mentioned that the more poor you are, the more you would lean towards supporting Hamas. So what's the role of the bourgeoisie, Palestinians in Gaza in supporting Hamas? That's 1. 2, did Hamas during the election 2005-2006 manipulate the polls that you've introduced during the election times? And 3, you've mentioned at the beginning that you prevent your, let's say, team from going to like dangerous places in Gaza. Did any member of your team have been like injured / dead in those safe areas and not by the IDF? Thank you.
In terms of support for Hamas, we need to distinguish between the core supporters of Hamas, and the core supporters are the base that shares Hamas's values. This is about religiosity, about identity, about political Islam. So these are the basic values. If you are an Islamist, there's a 90% chance you will vote for Hamas. But this is the core. Let's say that the alternative is Fatah, and Fatah, in your eyes, is corrupt, authoritarian. You don't share Hamas's values, but you think Hamas is incorruptible. This is why Hamas won the elections in 2006, because Hamas understood that the overwhelming majority of the Palestinians believed that their rulers were corrupt. Hamas' success was in elevating the issue of corruption to the top priority. That way, they convinced a lot of people who did not share Hamas's values to vote for them. Resistance, against Israeli occupation became, in the last 10 years, a very, very important issue, a top priority. There is a need to send a message to the Israelis that their occupation cannot continue forever. We need to inflict pain and suffering on them. Hamas can deliver. That gave Hamas a lot of support from people who did not share Hamas's values. So you will find middle-class people and even rich people supporting Hamas, either because of the corruption or because of resistance, the need for resistance. So one should not assume that Hamas, today in Gaza, the only people who support Hamas are those in the base, the core support. Nobody outside the core supporters of Hamas in Gaza support Hamas. In the West Bank, most of those who support Hamas today in the West Bank do not share Hamas's values. And so you'll find a lot of middle-class West Bankers supporting Hamas today. The manipulation in 2006, you're referring to the elections.
Not only elections, but also the polls by the Palestinian public policy.
At that time. Are you referring to that time or today?
Today and last time.
We don't think there was manipulation back then, and we don't think there was manipulation today. We have absolutely no evidence that there was. I know that some Hamas leaders said that they've asked their supporters to lie to pollsters so that we won't be able to predict the outcome of elections. I think they were bragging. I don't think there was any of that. I think the reason that we were not as accurate with support for Hamas back then is because we did not have any previous elections in which Hamas have participated. So we did not have a base in which we can compare attitudes and assign some reweighting ability on our side so that we can be in a better position to predict. The failure in prediction was only applied to Hamas, not to everyone else. At least I can say that about our surveys. We surveyed exactly what, we predicted exactly what Fatah would win. We predicted exactly what third parties would win. We only failed to predict what Hamas would be able to win. Our data collectors, we have about 75 data collectors in Gaza. They are all alive and well. None of them were injured. In many cases, their homes have been destroyed. We lost a lot of tablets that they use. There was a time in which we had to use paper and pencil to collect the data. We no longer do that. We now force them to use phones, or we supply them with new tablets. But we've lost a lot of that. But none of them have been killed or injured.
That's good to hear.
I'm Jonah. I'm a student from Los Angeles. My first question is, have you learned anything over the course of polling that would draw into question the honesty of survey respondents at any point? And my second question is, to what extent are Gazans concerned about the Israeli occupation in the West Bank?
Well, Gazans are, of course, concerned about the West Bank because the national identity is very strong in both West Bank and Gaza. And so that seems to essentially be one of the most important factor that affects the perceptions of Gazans of West Bankers and vice versa. So there is a very strong sense of national identity, need for national unity and so on, that this is why they punish Abbas, sometimes in the past also Hamas, because of the violation of the rules regarding national unity and so on. How do we know that people are honest in answering the questions? I'll tell you something. When we ask people occasionally in our surveys, do you think people will respond honestly when we ask them questions like the ones we have just asked you? Their response is no, of course not. But the next question is, how about you? Have you answered our questions honestly? 99% say yes. So they think they are answering honestly. but they think others are not answering honestly. And that is because of the perception. The perception we find are most of the time are inaccurate. People's own ability to accurately predict attitudes of other Palestinians, and of course, most importantly, other people like Israelis, is fairly documented, because every time we do surveys, particularly joint Israeli-Palestinian surveys, we ask 3 questions. We ask Israelis and Palestinians, do you support this idea or that idea, or this solution or that solution? The next question we ask them, and what do you think the majority on your side think about this? Does the majority on your side support or oppose this issue? And thirdly, we ask them, what about the majority on the other side? Do you believe the majority on the other side supports or opposes this position? They all get it wrong all the time. Absolutely. We've never found that people are getting things right. Because we've asked, the first question is, what do you think about the issues? So now we know what you think. The next question is, what do you think about others? Well, we have just asked that question, and people get that wrong. Not as much inaccuracy as the third question about the other side. Getting it on the other side is highly problematic. We used to get 2/3 supporting a two-state solution, but when we asked the other side, what do you think the majority on the other side says, only a quarter would say a majority on the other side would support this solution. This has very, very serious implications. We find that people who are able to accurately predict the attitude on their side or on the other side are the most moderate on both sides. So every time they get it wrong, they become more hardline. This inability to predict is also what we find when we ask people about the honesty of other people in answering questions.
Hi, my name is Ayman. Thank you for being here today, Professor. My question is, understanding that any agreement Palestinians reach comes with significant land compromises, we can see how challenging negotiations can be. However, do you think there's a scenario where Israel agrees to Hamas collaborating with the PLO to establish a unified Palestinian state under a two-state solution? And if so, what are your thoughts on the China-brokered unity deal between Fatah and Hamas? And could this deal pave the way for a more cohesive Palestinian strategy towards statehood?
On the China thing, let me start with that. No, I don't think there's anything serious in what Hamas and Fatah have done in China. Hamas and Fatah are not yet ready to sit down and reach any agreement on anything at the moment. I mean, there might be room in the future for the two sides to be able to do that. Right now, one of the most important difficulties which affect your first question is to get Hamas to accept, in principle, the two-state solution. In principle, Hamas says no to the two-state solution. It does not accept the two-state solution. But that is the position of the PLO, this is the position of the Palestinian Authority, and the Palestinian Authority does not want to associate itself with Hamas in controlling Gaza or in the West Bank if Hamas continues, or in the PLO, if Hamas continues to oppose the two-state solution. And this is why in the meeting in Beijing, this was Fatah's position. Fatah went there with a statement that it wanted Hamas to sign, which was about Hamas accepting agreements that have been signed by the PLO. That includes the Oslo Agreement, and it includes the principle of the two-state solution. Hamas has rejected that. It has opposed that, and it has rejected and continues to oppose the partition resolution of 1947. So this remains one of the most difficult issues domestically, and in terms of the ability of Fatah and Hamas to reconcile or have a joint Hamas-Fatah delegation to negotiate with the Israelis. The current Israeli government, of course, is not interested in a two-state solution or any kind of peace based on an independent Palestinian state. in the West Bank and Gaza. The question, therefore, is really theoretical. However, if we're talking about the Israeli public, your question is the Israeli public willing to accept the territorial dimension of a two-state solution, a state of Palestine within the boundaries of 1967? If I now ask Israeli Jews this question, would you support a two-state solution based on 1967? The overwhelming majority will say no. But I can get that overwhelming majority. In the same interview I conduct with those Israeli Jews, I can get two-thirds of them to change their mind and support the two-state solution. This is also true for Palestinians, as I indicated earlier. So Israeli and Palestinian public opinion, based on the first question we asked them, neither one is a force for peace. But based on the conclusion that I've indicated, I can confirm that neither opinion among Palestinians or Israeli Jews is an impediment to peace. If there are leaders who are willing to do what I can do in an interview, lead, that is, give incentives, convince people that this is good for them, leaders should be able to do that. Neither in Israel nor in Palestine do we have such a leadership today, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Before the next question, let me just check. Lizzie, can I go to 7:15? Do we have that time? Okay. So we still got a lot of questions here. I count 7 people, and I want to get all of them because we've had a lot of young men, and I'd love to have some young women, and they're at the end of the line, so I want to make sure that we get everybody in. So I'll ask you, although we have 15 minutes, ask your question as briefly as possible. You're welcome to go ahead. We'll have a little bit more gender balance in our sample of questions that we've had so far. So go right ahead.
Thank you so much. Speaking of, I was just wondering, and I know you might have touched on this a bit before, but do you think women in Palestinian society feel comfortable answering these polling surveys truly, honestly?
Yes, I do believe that women, and when we compare, we are able to understand answers from women, and that means they are telling us the truth. They are being honest with us. Women's answers are different than men, and it has to do with the socialization process they undergo as kids. And so women are less willing in Palestinian society, are less willing to challenge authority. Well, because it's a conservative society that basically forces them from young age to accept authority, their father, their brother, and so on. So this is what we get. Is it honest? We think so, because we are able to explain it. We are able to see where that comes from. Religiosity is part of it. Women are more religious in our society than men. And they are more conservative than men, even if they are not religious. Again, all of this starts from childhood.
Hi, thank you for coming. Speaking of early childhood, how do you see the educational system in the West Bank and Gaza playing into the opinions of Gazans and West Bankers? And then a follow-up on a different topic, what sort of leading do you do in your interviews to change people's minds? You mentioned the 67 borders, but what other compromises, say, on Jerusalem or on refugees, do you instill in your discussions that change people's opinions?
Good question. And I can answer the second question more intelligently than the first question. I have not done a very thorough examination of the Palestinian educational system to be able to answer your first question. But the Palestinian educational system is one that also maintains this conservative view of things, where although the Palestinian ruling elite is secularist, the system is not a secular system. Religion is part of the state. The Palestinian Authority is seen as the custodian of religion. Yes, these are not religious men in control, but they are secular men, but they view themselves as the custodian of religion. And so they assign, they build and protect religious institutions. They assign money and funding for religious institutions and religious purposes. And they use religion to mobilize support, whether they are in the opposition or in government. And so the educational system reflects all of that. I would say with an effort, particularly by the youth, to force a slightly more liberal view than what the overall society would accept. On the Israeli-Palestinian side of things, however, they are closer to the conservative. That is, the Palestinian narrative is followed to the letter. The history, people are told the history with little reference to the peace process, with little reference to progress in Israeli-Palestinian relations, focusing more on the history, on the rights of the Palestinians. So it's a rights-based approach of teaching. It is what the Israelis say about the Palestinian educational system, about incitement, all of that is all nonsense. There is no such thing, incitement to violence or hate of Jews and so on. We will find a lot of hate of Jews, but it's because of the occupation, not because of the educational system. The educational system is indirectly certainly responsible in some cases, well, because if you teach people these are their rights, this is their land, and this is what happened in their history, Israelis committed these massacres, of course they will hate the other side. But that is an indirect incitement. It's not the direct incitement that the Israelis claim that the educational system. Leading questions. Well, we start. This is a joint Israeli-Palestinian survey. We do the same for Israeli Jews. We don't do that for Israeli Arabs because Israeli Arabs is the group that is most supportive of almost everything in terms of compromises for peace. So they are, on our side, they are the safe side. It is Palestinians and Israeli Jews who are problematic for research purposes, problematic. That is, we do not get a majority from them. And the problem for us is how do we get a majority from them? So we start by offering them a detailed peace plan, very, very detailed. We ask about each and every component. And then we ask them about support for that package at the end. So are you for or against? If there's a referendum, would you vote for or against? We don't get much support for that. We get a quarter, for example, or a third who would say they support. 10 years ago, that percentage was much higher. 20 years ago, I could easily find a majority. I don't need to bribe people to support it. Now I need to bribe them. So how do I bribe them? I'll give you examples. There are some tangible, what we call tangible incentives and intangible incentives that we offer people. I mentioned tangible, for example, would be I would define the borders. But, and I'll give you another example of tangible. One of the most successful incentives, tangible incentives we found is to say to the Palestinians that this is economics, that laborers who today work in Israel, today very few work in Israel, but in the past hundreds of thousands used to work in Israel. If I now say to people, after peace and after we have a two-state solution, Palestinian laborers who today work in Israel will have guaranteed jobs in Israel. They can continue to work in Israel. That is sufficient to give me a majority, even though I started with a quarter or a third. That's a very successful incentive. Another tangible incentive is to say Israel will release all Palestinian prisoners as the agreement is implemented. That also gives me a majority immediately. Intangible incentives that would also give me a majority would be if I said the state of Israel will admit its responsibility for the creation of the refugee problem and will apologize for the suffering of the Palestinian refugees. This is not about compensation. This is not about money. Money is not mentioned, but it is a statement, an apology, or an admission of guilt and responsibility. This is very intangible. Similarly, we do the same for Israeli Jews. When we, intangible for Israeli Jews, for example, if we said, what if the Palestinian people or the state of Palestine recognizes that the state of Israel is the homeland for the Jewish people. This is sufficient also to give me a majority of Israeli Jews if I offer them that as a one-sided incentives. They don't have to pay a price for that. And if I want to give them a tangible incentive, I can say factories that are currently operating in the West Bank would continue to operate, and Israeli Jews would continue to have factories in the future Palestinian state. Factories do not have to be dismantled as part of the peace process. This does not give me a majority, but it does increase the level of support beyond the limits or the baseline that I started with. So these are the bribes, the sweeteners that we offer people. These are people who have said no. They will not accept the package that we have presented them. We go over a set of incentives. Over the last 10 years, we have tested dozens of such incentives, and we've built a database for policymakers. Whenever they return to the negotiating table, we can give them the list of policy measures, which we call incentives as part of our research, but there are nothing but policy measures that these negotiators can use at the negotiating table. And we tell them, if you use them, we guarantee that you will have a majority in your constituency supporting this package that you're negotiating.
Well, first of all, I've been following the PSCSR stuff since I was in high school. I was a really cool person in high school, as I'm sure y'all can tell. So this is really cool for me. I have a super duper quick question about you mentioned Marwan Barghouti. And he gets all the, in every poll that you've done and every poll that everybody does, he gets this widespread public support. This is despite the fact he's been in prison for 20 years. We don't actually really know. I mean, we knew 20 years ago he supported the two-state solution, but we don't know much about what he supports now. What do you make of the support for Barghouti? And obviously Israel and a lot of people in Israel think he's sort of this linchpin key for the two-state solution, his eventual release and release into Palestinian political life. What do you make of the support for Barghouti? Do you think people actually perceive, what do you think people see in Barghouti, and what do you think his role is in an eventual two-state solution?
Well, you have to invite me to come back here for another hour so that I can answer that question. But I can tell you that you're wrong if you think that being in jail does not mean we don't. I spoke to Barghouti when he was in jail over the phone. So I can tell you firsthand what I think his views are because he told me. But I also talked to his wife and I talked to his lawyers. And we know that he today supports a two-state solution. There is absolutely no doubt about that. And Palestinians know that he supports a two-state solution. And he is very popular. He basically, every secular nationalist Palestinian, which is about 2/3 of all Palestinians, support Barghouti, particularly among the youth. Barghouti is also perceived as a Democrat, as someone who would not be, as someone who's not corrupt, but also someone who would be good for the future of Palestinian democracy.
But also someone who favors resistance, right? And
yes, that is one of his appeal. Unlike Abbas and many other Fatah leaders who do not support resistance, Barghouti is seen as combining both. Barghouti is seen as Mandela. Mandela supporting violence on the one hand, initially starting with violence, and negotiating from in jail with his jailers. So for Palestinians, Barghouti is their Mandela, but of course, Mandela was about integration and equality. Barghouti is about separation and sovereignty.
Hey, how's it going? Thank you so much for coming. I actually was about to ask about Marwan Barghouti, but I guess not, because Disaster was pretty much my question. But what I did want to ask is, you mentioned that there has been some, not like an insane amount, but a degree of drop in support for Hamas, particularly in Gaza after the attacks. And so I wanted to ask you, if there were an election today, would Hamas win? I imagine yes. So then my question is also, what do you think it would take for that to be a no?
You would be wrong to think that Hamas would win elections. I can't give you 100% guarantee, but I'm almost 99% Hamas would almost never win majority in Palestinian elections if the electoral system is majority based. If it is proportional representation. That is, if 50% of the voters vote for you, you get 50% of the seats. This is not the system, the electoral system we had in 2006. It is because the system was different that Hamas won. In 2006, Hamas did not win a majority of the popular vote. Hamas won 44%, 44%. The opposition that lost the elections won 56% of the popular vote. Now the electoral system has changed. We now have proportional representation. So if you win 50%, you get 50% of the seats. Therefore, this immediately eliminates the possibility that Hamas would ever win a majority. It could win a significant minority, but not a majority. Based on today's findings, in Gaza, Hamas is actually below the core support. The core support for Hamas in Gaza is somewhere between 35 to 40%. In our most recent survey, Hamas is below 35%. In the West Bank, the support for Hamas is much higher, but most of that support would disappear by the time we hold elections. The support comes today from the perception that resistance is the top value. Elections are not likely to be held under conditions in which resistance and the demand for violence is the most important priority for the Palestinian public. So Hamas is not likely, the level of support for Hamas in the West Bank is likely to be about half of the support that it gets in the Gaza Strip. Support for Hamas in Gaza will recover, however, if we are holding elections in Gaza today, unlike the situation of war. So this is the opposite of what's happening in the West Bank. But overall, this fear that Hamas would win elections is not based on facts. There's no evidence whatsoever that at any given moment in the entire history of me doing surveys since 1993, I've never seen Hamas winning a majority of the popular vote.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Hi, I just had a really quick question, maybe a simpler one. My question was about whether the Israeli perception of the support of Hamas in Palestinian society is perhaps different from what your poll results have actually shown. And I was wondering, could this have a link with the recent poll results in Israel, which have shown, I believe, please correct me if I'm wrong, but support for basically what is happening in the Gaza Strip right now. So yeah, that's it.
Support of Israeli Jews for what's happening in Gaza today is very, very high. You're absolutely right. Do Israelis believe that if elections were held today, Hamas would win? The answer is yes. They believe that. As I said, the misperception, the inability to know what is happening on the other side is widespread among Israeli Jews and Palestinians. In 2021, we were supposed to hold elections in May 21. In April, Abbas canceled those elections. Earlier, in March, the Israeli Prime Minister and the Israeli government basically said, we're not going to allow elections in East Jerusalem because Hamas is going to win the elections. Those people who made those statements, by the way, I know for a fact, were not expressing their true belief about Hamas, because I spoke to them before they made the statement. I spoke to them after they made the statement. And I said, how do you come out publicly and say the opposite of what you actually believe? And their answer was, because this is politics. The Prime Minister wants us to say that. We said that. And so in an announcement by the Israeli Prime Minister or by anybody, a senior officer, that Hamas would win elections, and that Israel has evidence that Hamas would win elections would be absolutely, of course, nonsense, because they don't know. How would they know? They usually ask me whether Hamas would win elections, and I know that when they asked me, I told them, no, there is no chance that Hamas would win elections.
We have two more, and I don't want to cut us off. So if we can ask them quickly, maybe you can each ask, and then we'll allow Professor Shikaki to respond to both.
Sure. Hi, Professor Shikaki. Thanks for a wonderful talk. I have two questions. The first is about Marwan Barghouti. Of course, reports came out recently that he was assaulted by Israeli guards very violently, and so I'm wondering, given your personal ties to him and his family, can you tell us about how he is? Can you tell us about that incident? The second question I have is, you mentioned polling, and I noticed in your talk that polling is such an important, it gives us such insight into the Palestinian electoral process, or what little of it exists today. But especially now, I think the vast majority of Palestinians would say that the primary problems they face are not necessarily part of the electoral process. They're part of Israeli apartheid, genocide, and occupation. And so I'm wondering, what insight can polls offer us into that? Do Palestinians see polling as a part of their kind of national liberation? Thanks.
Don't answer yet. Ezedine, ask your question, and we'll...
Actually, it's almost a follow-up question on this. I want to hear not what the Palestinian society or public opinion is, but I want to hear your view on, given everything you know about the public opinion, and given those 3 decades of active involvement, I want to hear your view on ideas about one-state solution that are very, or let's say more popular on American campuses than any time in the past. They're seen as ways to decolonize or to end settler colonialism. They're seen as more democratic and egalitarian and so on. So I want to hear, based on your experience, what's your take on that?
I'm agnostic on this issue. I'm happy to live in a one-state solution with equal rights, and I'm happy to live in a two-state solution. But if you really force me to choose, I would go for a two-state solution. I grew up during the heyday of the national movement. Sovereignty is extremely important to me. National identity is extremely important to me. So I believe in a two-state solution. I do understand, of course, that ultimately to find a solution is more important than what kind of a solution it is, as long as it respects the basic needs and human rights and so on. So equality trumps sovereignty under such conditions. But if sovereignty can be obtained, then this would be my priority. Back to the questions about Barghouti. In terms of health, I don't know. I've read in the news, I've read what his son have said, what his lawyer have said, but I have not spoken personally with anyone. His son thinks that this was an attempt at his life, but I don't know. I think the Israelis would be crazy, of course, to do that. But the Israelis have done a lot of crazy stuff, so it is possible. Polling, most Palestinians are skeptical about polling. If you think this is part of national liberation, you would be wrong. Most Palestinians are, when we ask them about, do they believe the results of public opinion polls, their answer is no, we don't. So there's a risk. The Palestinians in general are very critical and skeptical of everything. Even when they participate in the data we collect, they are just skeptical in general. They do, however, want their views out. This is why the rejection rate, our rejection rate, is one of the smallest in any country in the world. Today, it used to be in Gaza, it used to be 13%. In the West Bank, slightly higher than that. Today in Gaza, it is 9%. So that's the extent to which Gazans want people to know what they think about the issues.
By the way, in the US, you can only get about 3% to say yes. So he's only finding 9% saying no.
Yes, in Gaza. In the West Bank, it is still higher than that, but it is one of the lowest in the world. So that means even though people, if asked directly, do you trust the results of public opinion surveys, the answer is no. They are, by their action, their behavior is indicating that they do want their views expressed and publicized.
We're just about out of time. I just want to say, as we close, I want to remind you of the importance of the kind of work that Professor Shikaki is doing. There are many ways that people who care about what's happening in that part of the world are acting to try to bring about peace. And many of those ways are very important. We're here tonight as part of an institution of higher learning. Most of you are students, and there's some faculty in the room. And so I think it's fitting that we spent tonight talking about the way that really rigorous research can contribute to the path to peace. And if you didn't see the connection between a lot of what Professor Shikaki was talking about and how we should think about peace, I think you weren't listening very closely, but I suspect that most of you got that point. So, and I think we're lucky to have had a chance to increase our own understanding of these questions. We don't often think of doing scholarly research as something that requires a heck of a lot of courage, whatever else it requires. But this is a case in which it really does, not only because there are real risks to people who are going around and doing polling in places where some people might not want that polling to take place, but also because Dr. Shikaki has reported results that just about everybody on one side or another doesn't want to hear. And to be able to do that year in and year out for 30 years is really quite an accomplishment. I hope you will keep doing it and keeping all of us informed about what's going on in Palestine. Thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you.